Well, the federal funding announced today includes help for Indigenous communities across Canada, where health services are often a serious challenge, and even more so in the face of an outbreak of a virus such as COVID-19. This issue will figure prominently, one would think, in the discussions between First Ministers on Thursday and Friday here in Ottawa. On Thursday, the First Ministers will meet with Indigenous leaders, and one of those leaders is the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Bellegarde. He is with me now. Good to see you, Mr. Bellegarde.
Good to be here, Peter.
Always good to talk to your Grand Chief, and good to have, that you gave us some time today to talk about some of these important issues. Let's start with this announcement today. Are you reassured by the announcement from the Prime Minister today that there is going to be help? Everything's being done to work with provinces and First Nations communities to ensure that they have what they need as they deal with this outbreak of COVID-19 and what might be coming.
Well, I think it's a good step, no question. We want to make sure that First Nations people aren't forgotten in all this planning and preparation, because we have over 50 plus fly-in communities. So can you imagine those fly-in communities that don't have access to potable water, clean water, drinking water, to even wash your hands?
Yeah, washing hands is one of the number one things they say to you.
There's two or three families in a two-bedroom house. So that would be catastrophic if COVID-19 hit those isolated communities. So we have to be really vigilant and make sure that all is being done to prepare and plan for less impacts on those flying communities right across Canada.
What have you heard from some of those First Nations communities in terms of their level of preparation? I mean, the government's obviously responding to concerns. Have they expressed concern and fear to you that, look, we don't, at the best of times, First Nations communities often don't have the means. And so in this kind of a situation, what are you hearing?
Well, we're basically, there's a fear. Like, for example, we had a conference call with our AFN Regional Chiefs yesterday and with officials from First Nation Inuit Health Branch in ISC Canada, and to make sure that those flying communities were not forgotten, like even flying in extra resources for hand sanitizer, extra resources to make sure that there's proper water in place, you know, in all those isolated communities. So we want to make sure that there's a constant communication on who do you call in terms of regional contacts, because it's not only federal government, but provincial, territorial governments have a big role to play, and working with First Nations leadership in that territory so that we're not forgotten. Even having a relationship with Red Cross, you know, and all those things have to happen. So it's very alarming. We just want to make sure that First Nations people aren't forgotten in all of this planning.
You'll have a chance to reinforce that message when you meet with the First Ministers on Thursday. The Prime Minister, then the First Ministers. What's your objectives at those meetings?
A number of things. It's a First Minister's meeting, right? And so the Prime Minister gets to call those. So it's his meeting, and he's called together the premiers. From our perspective, we have a number of things. Like you've seen all of the demonstrations and blockades with Wet'suwet'en and everything else. And to me, now is not the time to take your foot off that whole concept of reconciliation, but keep the foot on the gas. I think the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is a roadmap to reconciliation. And if you really want to create an environment that's ripe for investment and create economic certainty and economic stability, embrace the rights and title of Indigenous peoples and include them in decision-making sooner than later in all projects. So that's going to be number one, the UN Declaration. Another big piece that people have to get their heads around is Bill C-92. The new federal piece of legislation which respects First Nations jurisdiction over child welfare. So some provinces have a good working relationship with chiefs, others don't. For example, Premier Legault from Quebec is challenging the constitutionality, and I'm thinking, wouldn't it be better just to work with the 48 chiefs, you know, and start working out in a collaborative, cooperative way the relationship between the Quebec government and First Nations government? So UN Declaration, Bill C-92, MMIW and the action plan to implement by the end of June. So those are a number of the priorities we want to look at.
As you know, some premiers just don't see eye to eye with you on the UN Declaration and some of the changes that would involve and jurisdictionally for them and so on. What's your response to them? They say, look, you know, we're not happy with where this is going.
I would say it's a chance for education awareness and for dialogue. I've always said education awareness should lead to understanding, should lead to action and acceptance, because again, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission said the UN Declaration is basically a roadmap to reconciliation in Canada. To really get your head around that. And I think what's happened when you deny the existence of Aboriginal rights and title and treaty rights, then you get conflict. But when you recognize and embrace them and include them, that's where the understanding and stability comes in. And that's what I'm going to keep pushing for.
And tell me more about that. I mean, it would seem that the possible reaction would be to several weeks of blockades and economic disruptions that some of the people around the table and in the room where you're going to be on Thursday will say, look, this is not if we get blockades, we're not really interested in talking. And we heard some of that during the blockade, say, we're not interested in talking about moving forward till the blockades come down. That was the posture taken by some. And I'm wondering how big of a threat to reconciliation you think that approach is.
Well, I'd say, again, I don't think anybody should give up on reconciliation. I think all people, including First Nations people, should get behind it and keep pushing for that, including all levels of government. Now is not the time to stop on closing the socioeconomic gap. Now is not the time to stop investments in education and housing and water and infrastructure and child welfare. It's really important to do that. And I think reconciliation is not easy. It's hard. And I've said this before, that nobody is going anywhere. So let's roll up our sleeves and get to the table, get the dialogue and discussions going to find the proper policy and legislative frameworks necessary to respect Aboriginal rights and title. We need to start working together in a more cooperative way. And I think once you start doing that, you're not going to have those, I don't even call them blockades, I call it civil disobedience, and that's important to remember, that this whole situation came about because the land claims issue, and I don't like using the word land claim, it's land restoration. And then moving beyond the Indian Act. All of those things are the root social determinants of why these things happened. And we've got to find a better way to deal with those things.
And yet we're watching, we had a chief in town yesterday from the Wet'suwet'en territory saying, a female chief saying that the process has been hijacked by the male hereditary chiefs who opposed the Coastal Link gas pipeline, and the process has been corrupted because they're excluding women. Exactly. And those who support the Coastal Link gas pipeline. So a lot of people watching this say, isn't this something that has to be resolved within the Wet'suwet'en people themselves before everybody else can figure out their role?
Peter, that's exactly it. You've got to let the Wet'suwet'en people themselves, all the Wet'suwet'en people, the clan mothers, the traditional chiefs, hereditary chiefs, the Indian Act, duly elected chiefs, all their people have to get involved as the Wet'suwet'en people.
Right. But if they say that's not happening, if they say that's not happening in this process, are you concerned then about the legitimacy of it? If those voices aren't all being heard?
Then we've got to fix the process. But that's the work of the implementation of the Supreme Court decision called Delgamuukw. We've had Delgamuukw since 1997. So we've had it for 23 years. But nobody's really worked to really implement what it means on the ground, respecting Aboriginal rights and title, and really moving beyond the Indian Act in terms of governance structure. So this is a huge opportunity, but it's up to the Wet'suwet'en people themselves to make sure they get it done and get it right. The involvement, the inclusion of their hereditary chiefs, and the involvement and inclusion of their duly elected chiefs that support, the majority support the Coastal GasLink, and come together under their own laws and traditions.
All right, Perry Bellegarde, always good to talk to you. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks for the opportunity.